The Chicago mayoral election is just 1 week away, and everyone's talking about the race. It really has heated up. I'm here with Chris Jacoviak. He's our political expert for Chicago and the south suburbs. Chris is a really smart guy. Not entirely fully smart, though. He's a Packers fan. We haven't fully forgiven him for that. But other than that, pretty smart. Thanks for joining me, Chris.
Thank you, Collin. Thank you for having me.
So we want to talk about this race. First, let's talk about what has happened so far. This race, when we came into it, it was expected to be a Chuy Garcia, Lori Lightfoot battle royale, and to be honest, that is not what any of us got. We certainly didn't get what we paid for in this race, but we got something entirely different. Tell me, what are you seeing in the polls?
So the polls right now are still showing Chuy Garcia dropping significantly. When this race started, it was showing him in the way lead. It looked like Lori Lightfoot might not even make the runoff at the rate the race was going. But Paul Vallas came out as the only white candidate in the race, and he was able to consolidate that vote. He's way up in the polls right now. Lori has been remaining pretty consistent in recent weeks, and Brandon Johnson has taken advantage of Chuy Garcia's decline with progressives in order to make a recent bump in polling. So that's going to be what we're looking for in the last week of the election, to see how that polling looks the rest of the campaign.
What's important when you look at these polls is they're all over the map. And that's because there are two things that make up every election. There's affinity, and that's what polls can test. How might somebody vote? But what a poll can't test is propensity. We call that turnout in the political business. And that's, are you actually going to get off your butt and go and cast your ballot? And so these polls, what they do is they assume or they estimate what turnout might be. And so every pollster has a different estimate of what turnout might look like, and as a result, their numbers are all across the board. That's why we need an expert like Chris to help us look at the underlying numbers to understand what is actually happening in this race. All right, let's talk about some of the specific candidates because we talked about how Chuy Garcia was dropping, and that's a shock to everyone who's been watching this race. What is going on with Chuy?
Well, Chuy, I guess, just didn't take this race seriously. They believed that this was going to be a cakewalk to a runoff election. They wouldn't have to spend a lot of money. They just ride the name recognition and Latino vote to a runoff and take out whoever met them there. It seems like that's not really happening, as well, it costs a lot of money to turn Latinos out, and there's been more than one progressive in this race that have taken votes away from Chuy. They haven't really taken the race seriously until the last month or so. They're out with a new campaign ad on TV talking about gang violence in response to some of the attacks that's come across him in recent weeks, but it might be too little too late for Chuy Garcia unless he can get turnout up.
Yeah, I mean, Chuy's making all the right moves if this was a month ago. But unfortunately, it's not. It's 7 days to Election Day, which basically means it's an epic choke. Kind of like Aaron Rodgers in the playoffs, right?
Yeah. Very funny, I guess.
No comeback. What's going on with that? All right, let's talk about what might happen over the next 7 days. Election Day is next Tuesday. What are we going to see happen over these next 7 days? How will the race play out? That's what we're going to talk about here. And the first thing let's talk about is money. Which candidates have the resources to compete right now, and which candidates might end up having to go dark? What are you seeing?
Well, as always, Willie Wilson has the most amount of money. A man with that much money, whose hobby it is to run for office, he's always going to spend that money. Whether or not it's going to work is to be seen. Other than Willie, there's Paul Vallas. He's kind of set the pace for fundraising in this race for the last couple of months, getting a lot of checks from downtown in the business community, which has helped cushion his campaign account. Lightfoot started with a fundraising advantage, and she's been spending a lot of it in order to drive her positives up, and it might be beneficial to her. Chuy's been kind of steady, but more so like slow in terms of fundraising. He got $1 million from 150, and he hasn't really spent all of it at this point, which goes to they haven't taken this race seriously. And Brandon Johnson, he's getting a lot of money from the teachers union and other educational organizations. So he's getting a lot of money in recent weeks, and he's going to finish strong with that money.
So of these finalists that we're looking at in the polling, it looks like Vallas is going to be able to finish strong. It looks like Lightfoot might be starting to run out of funding here. Brandon Johnson's going to finish strong with money, and it looks like Chuy, once again, is bringing up the rear in this category. All right, last thing we look at is turnout. Chicago elections are always all about turnout, especially demographic turnout. You've got candidates relying on specific demographics to show up. First, what are you seeing? It's early, but we have some early numbers. What are you seeing?
So far with the early voting numbers, we're seeing very high turnout out of white working class wards on the periphery of the city. We're talking the 19th Ward, the 41st Ward, the 13th Ward. These are always very high turnout wards in municipal election, and this race is no exception. We're also seeing very high turnout out of Super Site downtown, which also benefits Paul Vallis in that regard, because he's going to be pulling a lot of that vote. And the outliers seem to be in the 21st Ward and the 4th Ward, where we're seeing 2 open aldermanic seats with a lot of challengers. So that's driving turnout up in those wards, which could be an advantage to Lori Lightfoot so much as Willie Wilson isn't getting a lot of those votes.
Yeah, and when we look at which demographics each of these candidates are relying on, based on the data, what we're seeing is that Lori Lightfoot really needs female turnout to be strong. She really needs black turnout to be strong. Vallis is relying on white turnout, conservatives, moderates. You need Brandon Johnson's relying on progressives. Chuy Garcia is relying on Latinos. And so when we look at how those demographics are and aren't showing up, what does that mean for each of those candidates?
Well, it's very good for Paul Vallis right now, and it might be good for Lori Lightfoot. The big issue is that Latinos just are not showing up on the early voting demographics. And they rarely do, but unless they turn out on election day, this is very bad for Chuy Garcia, which is a big movement from just 8 years ago when he ran against Rahm Emanuel, and he had this big coalition of not just Latinos, but progressive, some white voters. That we're just not seeing that this type of round where Chuy is relying exclusively on these Latinos, and he's not getting much vote from anywhere else at this point.
Well, let's put our picks on the record. It's always fun to make picks. So we're going to talk about what we think is going to happen 7 days from now, who we think might make the runoff, might not. Chris, what are you thinking?
So obviously, I think Paul Vallis is going to make this runoff. At this point, if he doesn't make it, it'd be a colossal failure on him and his campaign team. I don't think they miss it. They have the money. They've courted the white vote and the business vote to such an extent that we're going to get the percentage necessary to make this runoff. Other than him, I think Lori Lightfoot has this. She stayed out of the negative press lately. She's been driving up her positives, and people really haven't been hitting her so much because they want to face her in this runoff. The dark horse candidate, in my opinion, is Brandon Johnson. If it's not Lightfoot, it's probably Johnson at this point. He has the money down the stretch, and he has some momentum behind him. So right now I'd put it on Vallis Lightfoot, but don't forget Brandon Johnson.
Yeah, and I look at turnout and see where do I think turnout's going to be stronger than expected? Who's going to overperform the polls? I think Vallis is going to perform as well as we expect, maybe even a tad more. I think Chuy's going to underperform. I think Lightfoot might hold but might drop a bit. I think Brandon Johnson's going to overperform those polls. Those unions, his support, his base support, they are going to show up whether there's a monsoon on election day or a snowstorm. And so I'm going to go with the dark horse. I'm going to say it's going to be Vallis Johnson, and I think maybe it's just hopeful because I think that election is going to be fascinating. An epic battle between a really, really progressive candidate and a more mainstream conservative candidate. That could be a really fun race, so I'm going that route.
Well, it's going to be exciting the last week or so to see how this plays out. People have been looking forward to this for the past 4 years. Let's see who the next mayor is going to be.
And we all thought it'd be Lightfoot Chuy. Now we're talking about it might be 2 candidates, not even those 2. Gotta love Chicago politics. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. We're going to keep putting out information all throughout election night, so we'll make sure we get you the latest details of what's happening. Stay connected to us. Our social media profile links are with this video, so stay connected, and we'll talk again soon.